Terra Firma, Earth Day alarm. What I have to say today will involve a lot of science, but let's start with the religious grounding. You don't have to go back to the first creation myth in Genesis, the basis of the song I just sung, where Adam and Eve were given stewardship over all the plants and animals on the earth. There are basic problems with that concept, but to update it, if you look on the back of your order of service, you will see that our seventh UU principle is respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. And among the sources from which we draw inspiration are the, quote, spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with nature. Maybe this is best summed up in the saying attributed, or rather misattributed, to Chief Seattle: the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. The first Earth Day took place on April 22nd, 1970, 47 years ago. U.S. Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin witnessed the disastrous consequences of an oil spill in Santa Barbara, California. A few months earlier, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland had caught fire. Nelson was impressed with the organizational energy of the student anti-war movement at the time and wondered if the same kind of energies could be mobilized on behalf of saving the environment. So he announced plans for a national teach-in on the environment and persuaded a liberal Republican Congressman, Pete McCloskey, to sign on as co-chair. And they hired an organizer named Dennis Hayes out of Harvard, who built a national staff of about 85. They succeeded beyond their wildest expectations that first year. More than 20 million Americans took part in activities that first Earth Day. How many of you were among them? That's great. Our communications coordinator, Andrea Pluhar, was. She was 14 years old, and she remembers her mother dragging her to the first Earth Day celebration in Central Park, New York City. At that time, both the Hudson River and the East River were so polluted that the common wisdom was you couldn't touch the water, let alone swim in it. The politicians heard. In short order, the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act became law, and the Environmental Protection Agency was set up to oversee implementation of that law. Great powers were given to the agency to regulate industry. The power of the environmental movement and its early success alarmed some in industry. Conservative Virginia lawyer Lewis Powell wrote a strategy memo in 1971 for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in which he advised that the very free enterprise system was under attack, not just from communists or other voices on the far left. Quote, the most disquieting voices joining the chorus of criticism come from perfectly respectable elements of society, from the college campus, the pulpit, the media, the intellectual and literary journals, the arts and sciences, and from politicians. This is what we call the Powell Memo, 1971. Powell advised that U.S. business interests needed to mount a counterattack, and in the succeeding years, they did, focusing their resources on influencing government, not only at the ballot box, but in front of the regulatory agencies. 2 months after the memo, Powell was nominated by Richard Nixon to the seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. By the end of the 1970s, Powell had persuaded a majority of the justices on that court that the First and 14th Amendment protected the rights of corporations to free speech on public issues. That was the first national bank case against Bilotti, which paved the way for the complete blank check that the court gave corporations in Citizens United in 2010. Powell sounded the alarm over government regulation in 1971, and the businesses responded. It may seem that with all the anti-environmental rhetoric in the 2016 campaign, and the result of that campaign, and the subsequent actions of the administration, the corporations want a complete victory over the environmentalists, and the alarm needs to be sounded on the other side. But I don't think the issues are quite so simple. I'm not in favor of anyone resting in complacency, but I think that the habit of protecting the environment has soaked deep into American culture. Maybe my point of view is skewed because of where I live. Cape Cod is a tourist and retirement destination. Its shining seas and white sands, its water recreation and natural assets are what draw people here year after year. It is generally in the interests of most of Cape Cod's businesses to protect the environment. That isn't to say that protecting the environment is easy. I went to the Cape Cod March for Science yesterday in Falmouth, and one of the last speakers was a scientist and fisherman who talked about the problem of nitrogen in the estuaries. This is a consequence, as we all know, of human occupation, and becomes more severe the greater the population. In fact, he said it isn't really a problem in the off-season, but only in the summer. When I last looked at this problem, the solution was expensive sewer systems, and Chatham bit the bullet under the leadership of our own Fred Jensen, and with the help of a substantial grant from the federal government, is building a state-of-the-art sewer system to deal with the nitrogen problem. But this speaker in Falmouth had a different solution: oysters. He said that oysters naturally filter out the nitrogen out of the water, releasing it harmlessly into the atmosphere, where it is most of the atmosphere anyway. To me, this illustrates the thousands of ways that human ingenuity is trying to cope with compensating for the damage that our occupation does to the earth. Andrea mentioned another the other day. The Hudson River, one of the country's most magnificent, is clean enough for swimming through most of its length today because of laws in place, but also because of the activism of a group of people organized by a great banjo hero of mine, Pete Seeger. The sloop Clearwater has sailed tirelessly up and down the river for 30 years, cajoling and encouraging industry to clean up its act. And I can't resist pointing out that Pete, rest his banjo-picking soul, was a UU. I think efforts by private, nonprofit groups like Clearwater have a place in the solution, particularly the solution for the major environmental problem of 47 years ago, pollution. But climate change, today's major environmental problem, presents a more existential threat. IRAS, the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, is devoting its summer conference at Star Island this year to what it calls the wicked problem of climate change. Wicked not in the sense of evil, but in the sense of resistant to an easy solution. Here's how the conference statement puts it. Quote, climate change is a wicked problem with causes and consequences in economic, ecological, ethical, and technological realms. As climate change continues to alter our planet, how can we use this monumental change as an opportunity for societal and spiritual transformation? Unquote. But why is climate change so wicked? Why is it so resistant to solution? For one thing, it has so many moving parts. The whole thing is caused by the greenhouse effect, which traps sunlight in the lower layers of the atmosphere because certain gases act like the glass in a greenhouse, keeping the space warm because more sunlight comes in than radiates out. The most important greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, which comes from burning fossil fuels such as coal, natural gas, or petroleum. But another significant one is methane, which is generated by cattle, among other things. So if we ate less beef, we'd generate less methane. Methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but we haven't much worried about it until now because there's so much less of it in the atmosphere. But there is a lot of methane which is stored in the permafrost in the Arctic. A 2015 report from scientists right at Cape Cod's own Woods Hole Research Center, showed how as the permafrost warms due to carbon dioxide-induced warming, it will release methane gas, which will accelerate the warming even more. Another dimension of the wickedness of the climate change problem is the gap between industrial nations and non-industrial nations. The only time I've ever set foot in Asia was a trip to Indonesia in 1990. I can remember that culture shock started on the trip into the town of Yogyakarta from the airport. I was astonished to see women walking down the highway with poles on their shoulders, from either end of which hung large buckets of water. They were simply moving water from one location to another, from a communal well perhaps to their family compound to use for cooking or cleaning. That was only the beginning. I saw so many things being done in that society by human muscle or animal power, which in America were done by machines. When I got back to the States, I asked my mother, who grew up in Columbia, SC in the 1920s, whether most work in her childhood was done by humans, machines, or animals. She said it depended on where you were. She spent a lot of time in the country with her grandparents, and horses were basic for transportation and for farm work. But in the city, automobiles and streetcars predominated. That's sort of a little snapshot of what the Industrial Revolution has done with us. The carbon dioxide which threatens to doom the planet is a byproduct of industrialization. But much of the rest of the world is trying to catch up to the industrialized nations, and it is hardly fair to say to China, India, Indonesia, or Brazil that they can't enjoy the benefits of energy consumption because we've already consumed their share. If we're going to limit carbon consumption, we have to find some formula that does it fairly. These considerations have made negotiating climate agreements difficult, but not impossible. Because the United States is the biggest producer of greenhouse gas, its leadership in setting targets to reduce them is very important. And there's another inequality which is just as significant as the inequality between the rich and the poor nations. The inequality between those nations most vulnerable to climate change and those who are less vulnerable. Rising sea levels will have little effect on Switzerland or Nepal, but could wipe out many South Pacific atolls. In America, while the real estate values of our little spit of sand projecting out into the ocean are high, the Cape as a whole is much more vulnerable than, say, the Berkshires. The Paris Accords on climate change are the third major international agreement on the subject, and they entered into effect on November 4th, 2016, when 143 of the 197 parties to the convention had ratified it. 4 days later, the United States elected a president who had pledged to withdraw from the Paris Accords and who has said climate change is a Chinese hoax. However, the administration has yet to do anything to withdraw from these accords, and it would be quite complicated to do so. While a climate skeptic is in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Secretary of State was formerly head of ExxonMobil and had to deal with the realities of climate change every day. It's appropriate to sound the alarm on climate change and to be prepared to oppose any government attempts to undo these agreements. But I am reading the news and watching what the government does as well as what it says. Rick Perry, who once said he would abolish the Department of Energy, has been installed now as its head. If we only knew that he was the former governor of Texas and that Texas is synonymous with the oil industry, we would see him only as an apologist for fossil fuels. Yet paradoxically, while he was governor of Texas, Texas took the lead in development of wind energy. We can hope that this might give a powerful incentive for Perry to support wind and other renewable energy sources nationwide from the federal level. It is true that fossil fuel money has an outsized influence in our politics. But as renewable energy becomes cheaper, The demand for fossil fuels will diminish simply by action of the markets. And science has its own powerful stories. At the March for Science yesterday in Falmouth, we heard from a genetics counselor. She told about a couple she had counseled who came to her when they had 3 children and were expecting a 4th. The 2 oldest children had no medical issues. The 3rd child had a rare condition linked to a specific gene which will cause significant issues in early childhood and could lead to an early death. The couple wanted to know if the child now in the womb had this unlucky combination of genes to help them to decide whether to carry the pregnancy to term. Tests on the fetus showed 2 things. 1, it didn't have the unlucky genetic trait, and 2, its blood and chemistry were compatible with that of the child who did have the problem. So the pregnancy went through, and at that child's birth, stem cells were harvested from the placenta, which were able to be introduced into the sick child, completely curing the condition. A child who would have suffered an early death will live to a normal life because of the advances of science. On Earth Day, it is appropriate to sound the alarm about any cutbacks in funding or support for science. For it is only through science that we will be able to deal with the wickedly complicated problems facing the world. There have been predictions that websites of key government agencies may go dark. That's a concern, but so far it has not happened. I went yesterday on the website of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and found a pretty thorough account of climate change with the familiar graphs and the familiar statement that 97% of climate scientists agree that human-caused climate change is happening. I think this bears checking every so often to see that it is still there. That, of course, is only the public face of the agency, and I didn't know how to check to see if the underlying data that scientists need to assess and share is still available. The terror in my title this morning has nothing to do with people from extreme political factions committing murders to make headlines, and everything to do with how we're going to sustain life on this planet if we deny everything we know about the peril we're in. As you know, I have a grandchild, as do many of you. We want our grandchildren and their grandchildren on down through the generations to live in a livable world. 3 things alarm me about the prospects for my grandson's future. 1, the spending of megabucks by fossil fuel interests in the political and governmental realm to protect their investment and keep us burning dirty forms of energy. 2, the ignorance of science among much of the public, as well as determined efforts to undercut science by defunding and denigrating it. And 3, the embrace by certain conservative religious strains in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism of apocalyptic readings of ancient texts. There are folks who believe that Armageddon is coming and will bring about the end of history and see all that as a good thing. It won't. We have lots of films in the past decades imagining life in a post-Armageddon world. It is not pretty. I won't be around to see it in my lifetime, but it is not something I would wish on my descendants. We have red flags waving all around us this Earth Day, and yet the sky has not started to fall. I was buoyed by the crowd which turned out on a rainy Saturday on the Falmouth Green. I got into my car and I left the Falmouth Green to return to Chatham for last night's fabulous potluck. As I turned off right to get off Main Street and then turned right again on the street which parallels Main Street, I noted the sign. The street was named for Falmouth's most famous daughter, Catherine Lee Bates, and her great hymn seemed an appropriate way to pray for our future. So I sang it all the way back to Chatham. and will offer as my closing prayer to these reflections my favorite lines from the second verse. America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Amen. Thank you, Frank.